Okay, so here we are for chapter 2 then. This is Miriam, which we've just had mentioned at the end of the last chapter. So we've got this kind of epistrophe across 2 chapters this time, which, as I said last time, is linking and driving the narrative forward. So this does feel like a piece of fiction writing because there is a clear narrative thread. This isn't just an ambling travel writing. This has a real agenda and a real thread with characters and people. Well, not characters, people who are characterised. So there's this constant borrowing from a novelistic fiction style. And here we have this epistrophe between the Miriam from the last chapter and now the chapter heading itself, Miriam, as we go into chapter 2.
Chapter 2. Miriam. I work at the Overseas Television Service in what was West Berlin. The service was set up by the government after the war to beam benign Germanness around the globe. My job is to answer letters from viewers who've been beamed at and have some queries.
Okay, so here we have, moving things forward, she works at the Overseas Television Service. And so we're still in that present tense. But she uses this neologism, this new word. I'll come back to that in a second. But the Germanness around the globe. Now, that's not a real word, is it, Germanness? But we understand what she means. And it's creating a noun from an adjective in a way. She's turned the word German, which is obviously a noun, into an adjective, meaning to be German. And then she's turning that made-up adjective back into a noun again, as in Germanness, if that makes any sense. So the technique there is a neologism. It's a new word, Neologism. So she's creating a neologism by referring to Germanness around the globe. And beaming benign Germanness. There's some alliteration here as well with beaming benign Germanness. And then again in the last sentence we get beamed at and have some queries. So there's a repetition of these B sounds, these plosives. And I guess, I don't know, the sort of beaming sounds quite forceful, doesn't it? This, forcing themselves, the Germanness around the globe. Although it is benign, it's quite clear to sort of assert that's been different from anything earlier in Germany's history that might be less benign. My job is to answer letters from viewers who've been beamed at, more plosives there, been beamed at, and have some queries. It's kind of humour, isn't it? It's like almost suggesting that the people are just passive, receiving this Germanness through the airwaves, and so there's sort of it's humour really. It's this fact that they're sort of beaming it quite aggressively into people's homes. And these viewers who've been beamed at and who've received this information have some queries. So she's overusing that word beamed, I think, just to sort of play on the humour of that a little bit.
At Viewer Post, I'm a cross between an agony aunt, a free research assistant, and a receptacle for messages in bottles.
Yeah, so you've spotted it there. There's the triadic structure, those 3 things there, a list, a free research assistant, an agony aunt, a free research assistant, and a receptacle for messages in bottles. Triadic structure, and as we come to expect, the third of those things is a little bit of an anticlimax. It's some bathos, Bathos, bathos there for the last one, because of course the first 2 seem like more predictable jobs in the role that she's doing, and then a receptacle for messages in bottles seems is obviously a metaphor in itself. It's these sort of messages from people sending these words in from nowhere, almost never expecting to be read, and she's the one that picks up these sort of drifters and wayward messages that are really pointless, like messages in bottles are sort of cast into the sea and probably never read. So she's making, again, more humour, but also the bathos there makes us realise how sort of pointless her job there is, her role in a way.
Dear Viewer Post, I am looking for the address of the clinic of Dr. Manfred von Arden to try his new ultra-high temperature cancer treatment for advanced stages, as featured in your program. Dear Viewer Post, many thanks for your interesting program on asylum seekers in your country. I am 16 years old and living in Accra. Could you please send me informations on asylum? The occasional neo-Nazi from Missouri or Liverpool writes, wanting information on mother groups in East Germany. A man from Birmingham, Alabama, sent me a photograph of himself in uniform at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945, standing behind corpses. He wrote, Thank you for your program on the 50th anniversary of the peace. I would like you to know that I recall with great fondness the welcome we Americans received from the ordinary German people. In the villages they had nothing, but when we came, they shared it with us like family. I write contained and appropriate responses. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be German.
So, of course, there we're getting these real quotations from the letters she's receiving, and giving, excuse me, a bit of a characterization there to these types, whether they're from Liverpool neo-Nazis or whether they're servicemen from Birmingham, Alabama, and we get that sort of. Again, we have to be careful. Obviously, on the audiobook version, we get her voice in the accent, but even still, straight off the page, we've got this characterization of these people. And if we just skim towards the end of that paragraph we just finished with, I write contained and appropriate responses. Now, that's a bit of a euphemism, contained responses. It means diplomatic, doesn't it? She's sort of, her job is just to acknowledge these people sent a letter in, but not really to get in, just to develop the conversation. It's very much just a contained diplomatic acknowledgement, receipt message, really. And so you can see there that she's using a little bit, in fact, sort of hendiadys there. There's contained and appropriate responses. They both mean the same thing, so there's a bit of hendiadys there as well, in the way that she describes that. That in itself is quite diplomatic. Even describing it to us now as that is sort of diplomatic, and shows how cautious she had to be, and she knew the sensitivity of the position she was in.
Alexander Scheller is my boss. He's a tall man, just on 40, who has a picture of a tight-faced blonde wife, a glass ashtray, and a permanent cup of coffee on his vast and otherwise empty desk.
So a couple of things here. We've got the asyndetic list of the things on his desk, which happen to be a group of 3. So a picture of his wife, a glass ashtray, and a permanent cup of coffee. And again, the third one of those things, the last one in the structure there, in that list, is hyperbole, isn't it? It's exaggeration. It's not a permanent cup of coffee. It's a slight bit of bathos as well. These other 2 things are fixed. There's a glass ashtray there. There's a photograph of his wife, and then this cup of coffee, which again is more. It's actually characterizing him, isn't it? It's more to do with his addictions and his sort of need for stimulants, really, than it is about anything else. So by placing that last and giving us that bathos, and the hyperbole as well, the permanent cup of coffee suggests that need for caffeine and the nicotine as well, that's described in the next couple of sentences, or next sentence.
He taps incessantly, fidgety with caffeine and nicotine. To his credit, he does me the honour of behaving as if my work answering viewer correspondence is as important as that of the journalists and professional people here. A month ago I sat on the other side of that desk, because he had made time for a meeting I called myself. Scheller's offsider, Uwe Schmidt, was there too. Uwe's main job as adjutant is to make Scheller seem important enough to have an adjutant. The other part of his job is to appear busy and time short, which is more difficult because he has hardly anything to do. Scheller and Uwe are both Westerners. Uwe has a similar amount of TV journo energy to Scheller, only Uwe's is sexual, not chemical. Uwe's girlfriends are always leaving him, and he is therefore, at most times of the day, and in almost any company, deeply distracted by desire.
So there we've got a couple of things. Excuse me. If we go back up to the top of that last paragraph, Uwe has a similar amount of TV journo energy. We've got the slang there of that, the sort of jargon of the world of journalism. So the TV journo, it's a compound adjective there. It's a compound word, TV journo, meaning journalist, and it's using the sort of the slang or the nomenclature or the jargon, you can call it anything you like, really, that you would find in that world of work, just like we do in any world of work. And then towards the end of that paragraph, we've got the 3 Ds, the 3 heavy alliteration there of deeply distracted by desire. And I think just, again, you might think, well, this is a bit desperate and we're picking up things that aren't really there. But I think given that we know Funda writes in a novelistic style, I think we have to be aware of, well, even if it's not intentional, the effect is still the same. it makes that slightly heavier, deeply distracted by desire, and the sort of the heaviness of those D's suggests just how heavily distracted he is too, perhaps.
I like Uwe and feel sorry for him because I know that in looking for the reason why his girlfriends leave him, he has started to wear himself out from the inside. I recently saw him singing, "You're once, twice, 3 times a lady," in English in his car at the lights with tears on his face. Now, over the other side of the desk, he caught himself looking at me like food, and I knew he hadn't heard what I was saying.
So that's an obvious one to pick up, and I think from the figurative use of language there, looking at me like food. That I mentioned before last chapter, the use of these sort of hard-boiled detective-style phrases and the things you might find in a Raymond Chandler novel like The Big Sleep, and that's a good example of that. I think when you've got objectifying her to the point of looking at her like food, it's a basic simile, but it's quite telling, isn't it? And it shows how deep his desire is, and it reinforces what's just been said about him being left by his girlfriends and always being distracted by desire.
"Pardon?" he said. I decided to start from the beginning. "We've had a letter from a German living in Argentina in response to the item on the puzzle women." "Puzzle women? Puzzle women," Uwe said, trying to remember the story. "They sit in Nuremberg puzzling together the shredded files the Stasi couldn't burn or pulp." "Right, I'm with you," Scheller said. He was tapping the eraser end of a pencil on the desk. "This man says he left Dresden after the war. He asks whether we might do an item on what things are actually like now for the East German people, instead, as he says, of always broadcasting what is being done for the poor cousins." "Puzzle women," Uwe muttered. I took a deep breath. "And I agree with him."
Okay, so what Anna Funder does here then is, we find this again and again, but she frames the speech with narrative. So we're sort of we're given direct speech, as we have from her conversation with Uwe and with Scheller, but then we're reminded of how she acted as well. So we've got this narrative alongside speech, which is very novelistic. It's something you would find in fiction. So, for example, I took a deep breath, and I agree with him. And then, so we're sort of constantly jerked back away from the speech to remind us of what the action is like in the exchange as well. This becomes much more pronounced when she speaks to Miriam, and further on Julia in the book, particularly when she's in Julia's kitchen. There's some really good examples of that, which I would recommend using for the comparative. But if you're building up a collection of examples, as you will be doing, there is examples of it here as well. So whenever there's speech, always looking out for how it's framed by narrative as well.
"We're always talking about the things that Germany is doing for people in the former GDR. It would be great to do an item from the Eastern point of view. For instance, to find out what it's like to wait for part of your file to be pieced together." "You know, we don't broadcast domestically," Scheller said, "so there's no point us doing items on the Osses for their gratification." I looked to Uwe off to one side with his feet up on Scheller's acreage of desk. He was rolling a fountain pen over his knuckles, lost in a reverie, puzzling over women. I know, I said to Scheller. "But East Germany, I just think we should know some of the stories from there. From here, I mean." "What sort of stories?" Scheller asked. Behind him the computer gave off a glockenspiel beep signalling new email. "I don't know," I said, because I really didn't know. There must be people who stood up to the regime somehow, or who were wrongfully imprisoned. I felt myself warming up, a little dangerous.
So there we've got it happening again, this the past and the present being used in juxtaposition there. You've got the reminders of herself. I felt myself warming up, a little dangerous, thinking back and remembering. But we have to be mindful of the fact this is being recounted from years later. So we're being immersed in this as if it's absolutely accurate and true. But we must remember that this is just her recollection, her memory. And whether it exactly happened in this way is anyone's guess. Probably not, because she'll remember it, as we all do, in her own way. she won't have transcribed these or recorded these conversations for transcription later on. So we'll just be mindful of that. But she's using the past and the present there in juxtaposition to create that effect of reminding us that she's telling us this story, but also immersing us in the detail.
I mean, after World War II, people searched high and low for the smallest signs of resistance to Hitler, as if a tiny piece of national pride could be salvaged and tied onto a couple of student pacifists and a bunch of old Prussian aristocrats. What about here? There must have been some resistance to the dictatorship. They aren't a nation. Scheller was tetchy now. I know, but it was a nation. Look, he said, they are just Germans who had communism for 40 years and went backwards. And all they want now is the money to have big TV sets and holidays in Mallorca like everyone else. It was an experiment and it failed. Well, what do you suggest I write to this guy? I could hear my voice getting higher. Should I tell him that no one here is interested in East Germans and their stories because they don't form part of our overseas image? Oh, for God's sake, Scheller said. You won't find the great story of human courage you were looking for. It would have come out years ago, straight after 1989. They are just a bunch of downtrodden whingers, with a couple of mild-mannered civil rights activists among them, and only a couple at that. They just had the rotten luck to end up behind the Iron Curtain. He tilted his head. What has gotten into you? Uwe put his feet down. Are you all right? Uwe walked back to my desk with me, solicitous as a doctor with a patient who's had bad news. That he did this made me realize I'd gone over the top. He said, He's simply not interested. No one is interested in these people. Look. Uwe touched my forearm gently, turning me towards him like a dance partner. His eyes were green and slanted up, his teeth short and neat, little pearls.
So more figurative language there then, describing him like a dance partner, or describing her like a dance partner. Sort of, I guess, fitting with the semantic field of romance and desire that he has been associated with. And then you've got this description of his eyes, green and slanted up, his teeth short and neat, little pearls. You remember from the first chapter, she's not particularly flattering with her descriptions, particularly of women, it seems. But here, this is quite, complimentary, isn't it? Pearls being something quite precious and valuable.
You're probably right. No one here is interested. They were backward and they were broke. And the whole Stasi thing... He trailed off. His breath was minty. It's sort of embarrassing. I replied to the Argentinian, thanking him for his suggestion, but telling him that, regrettably, the station's remit is only for current affairs and news, and we are therefore unable to investigate more personal, point-of-view stories. A week ago he wrote back. He was angry, telling me that history is made of personal stories. He said that issues were being swept under the carpet in East Germany, and people along with them. It took 20 years after the war, he said, for the Nazi regime even to begin to be discussed in Germany, and that process is repeating itself now. Will it be 2010 or 2020 before what happened there is remembered? He wrote. And why are some things easier to remember the more time has passed since they occurred? The woman opposite me wakes up as the train pulls into Leipzig. Because there is something intimate about watching another person sleep, she now acknowledges my existence. Wiedersehen, she says as she leaves the compartment. Miriam Weber stands at the end of the platform, a small, still woman in the stream of alighting passengers. She holds a single rose in front of her body, so I will know who she is. We shake hands, not looking too closely at first, talking about trains, trips, rain. It feels like a blind date, because we have described ourselves to each other. I know she has not told her story to a stranger before.
So here in this paragraph, we've got the asyndetic list then, haven't we, of trains, trips and rain, heightened by the fact there's still no connective even before the word rain. Trains, trips, rain, and again, bathos, the last one there being something quite downbeat. So we've got the trains, trips, so the idea of journeys and adventure, and the last one of the three in that triadic structure being the bad weather, being rain.
We drive through Leipzig. The city has been transformed into a building site, a work in progress with some new goal. Cranes are picking over holes open as wounds. People ignore them, weaving head down along footpaths and alleyways. On one of the concrete towers, a large Mercedes emblem rotates, waltzing to the new tune here.
This time we've got the personification of the area itself, the land itself. So cranes picking over holes open as wounds. So personifying the ground, even the Germany itself, and then people weaving head down along footpaths and alleyways. Hendiadis there with those to show the variety of ways in which people move around, not interested in Leipzig and the progress. And then even in that last sentence, one of the concrete towers, a large Mercedes emblem rotates, waltzing to the new tune here. Again, that sort of metaphor of dancing again, maybe extended from the previous point about like a dance partner, but the idea of sort of moving on to a new time and dancing to a new tune, almost dancing to a different tempo. Interesting metaphor to use though. Waltzing is sort of an old-fashioned style of dancing, I guess, isn't it? So whether that's significant or not, I don't know. Depends how you want to use it, really. But it's there to identify.
Miriam's apartment is in the roof of her building. There are 5 flights of stairs, broad, sweeping stairs with a graceful dark balustrade. I try not to puff too loudly. I try not to think about my damaged head. I try to remember when elevators were invented. When we reach it, the apartment is one big light space under the eaves, full of plants and lamps, with views over all of Leipzig. From here you could see anyone coming.
And that's quite telling, isn't it? That reference there to "from here you could see anyone coming" is a short sentence. It's a short telegraphic sentence. It doesn't do anything beyond explain the facts, but actually there's a subtext there, isn't there? Not only the Stasi observing, but also the sort of nature of Miriam being quite paranoid and sort of self protective and looking out across Leipzig. So that last sentence there is, in its own way, I think the fact it's at the end of a paragraph and it's such a short, simple sentence, it adds more effect there and perhaps leaves the reader to examine some of the subtext.
We sit in large cane chairs. Miriam, when I look at her straight, is a woman in her mid-40s with a cute short haircut, the bits on the crown sticking out like a cartoon boy, and small round glasses.
So they're more figurative language there, sticking out like a cartoon boy. Again, it's not particularly complimentary, but it's not the worst that she's given, certainly when describing women earlier in the book. But it just adds that rich characterization. It's very important for her, it seems, for Funda, to immerse the reader and for the reader to imagine what these people look like, so we can experience it alongside her.
She wears a long black sweater and pants and curls her legs under her. She has a surprisingly big, nicotine-stained voice. She is so slight that the voice comes from nowhere and everywhere at once. It is not immediately evident that it is hers. It fills the room, and it wraps us up.
So more metaphor there, this idea of the voice wrapping us up and filling the room. It's hyperbole, filling the room, and wrapping us up is a metaphor. But there's something safe, isn't there? There's something securing about being wrapped up, and there's something, a sort of an experience to Miriam that Funda seems to quite, feel comfort from, I think. And the fact that her voice is big, and it wraps her up in sort of sense of safety and experience perhaps as well.
I became officially an enemy of the state at 16. At 16!
So the repetition of 16 there is, well, repetition, but also epistrophe, because it's at the end of that sentence and then picking up again at the next, for emphasis, obviously, on Miriam's part, really. This isn't Funda's own creation, unless Funda has reorganised the text, but assuming that this is as verbatim as she can make it, the epistrophe there emphasises how young she was when she became an enemy of the state, and how severe the Stasi were if they were going to make enemies of children.
Miriam looks at me through her glasses, and her eyes are wide and blue. In her voice is a combination of pride in how she became such a fiend, and disbelief that this country created enemies of its own children. You know, at 16, you have this sort of itch. In 1968, the old university church in Leipzig was demolished suddenly, without any public consultation. 250 kilometers away, the Prague Spring was in full swing, and the Russians had not yet brought the tanks into the streets to crush the demonstrators for democracy. The demolition of the church in Leipzig provided a focus for the expression of a widespread malaise the Leipzigers had caught from their Czech cousins. 23 years after the end of World War II, the next generation was asking questions about the way their parents had implemented communist ideals. The Leipzig demonstrations were interpreted by the East German regime as a sign of the times, a cinder likely to ignite.
Again, another metaphor there than this cinder likely to ignite is that figurative choice, but suggesting quite an explosive time, a dangerous, unpredictable time, that the fact that the whole country, the whole society is poised, ready for some sort of rebellion or some sort of impact. So it's a powerful metaphor to use there. Again, it's something you expect from a fiction, a novel, but she's using it here to bring that style to her writing, really, to make this very readable and very immersive.
The police doused people with fire hoses and made many arrests. Miriam and her friend Ursula thought this was not right. At 16, you have an idea of justice, and we just thought it was wrong. We weren't seriously against the state. We hadn't given it that much thought. We just thought it wasn't fair to rough people up and bring in horses and so on.
So just going back to that phrase, at 16, we've seen that 4 times now. At 16, at 16. At 16 you have this sort of itch, and at 16 you have an idea of justice. So this anaphora constantly through this page here of at 16, just I think to emphasise the sheer youth of Miriam and her friend Ursula, and how surprising it is that the Stasi would look to demonise someone so young.
The two of them decided to do something about it. At a stationer's, they bought a child's stamp set with ink, small rubber letters, and a rail to put them in. You could buy that sort of thing? I ask. I know that Roneo printers, typewriters, and later photocopiers were strictly, if not particularly effectively, controlled by license in the GDR. Not after what we did, she smiles. The Stasi had them taken off the shelves. Miriam and Ursula made leaflets. Consultation, not water cannon. And People of the People's Republic, speak up. They stuck them up around town one night. The girls wore gloves so as not to leave fingerprints. We had read as many novels as the next person, she says, laughing. Miriam had the posters tucked in her jacket. Ursula had a tub of paste and a brush hidden in a milk crate. They were clever. They slapped the leaflets up in telephone booths over the instructions and at tram stops over the timetables. We wanted to make sure people read them. They made a circle around the town, and then they went straight through it. The girls passed the Communist Party regional headquarters. Things were going well. We just looked at each other, and we couldn't resist. They marched in and told the guard on duty they were there to see Herr Schmidt, on the off chance that someone by that name was in the building. They didn't stop to think what they would have done had a Herr Schmidt come out. The guard made a call. He put the phone down. No, Comrade Schmidt's not here at the moment. The girls said they would come back the next day. On the way out, there were these beautiful smooth columns. Miriam is convinced, however, that had they left it at that, they would have gotten away with it. But on the home stretch, they went one step too far. Passing a building where some of their classmates lived, they put leaflets in the letterboxes of 2 boys they knew. The next day, one of the parents rang the police. Why would you call the police about some junk mail? I ask. Because they were silly, or maybe they were in the party. Who knows? It seems so harmless, I say. Miriam comes back quiet but strong. At that time it was not harmless. It was the crime of sedition.
Okay, so that word sedition is one that comes back again further down this page, and it just simply means that rebellion. So an act of sedition is an act of rebellion, usually against an authority or a state. In this case, obviously the Stasi, and in a sense the whole of the German Democratic Republic as well.
In East Germany, information ran in a closed circuit between the government and its press outlets. As the government controlled the newspapers, magazines, and television, training as a journalist was effectively training as a government spokesperson. Access to books was restricted. Censorship was a constant pressure on writers and a given for readers who learnt to read between the lines. The only mass medium the government couldn't control was the signal from Western television stations, but it tried. Until the early 1970s, the Stasi used to monitor the angle of people's antennae hanging out of their apartments, punishing them if they were turned to the west. Later, they gave up. The benefits of soporific commercial programming apparently outweighed the dangers of news bulletins from the free world. Sedition was handled by the secret police, not the ordinary Volkspolizei. The Stasi were methodical.
So that short sentence there, the Stasi were methodical. These short sentences, often after lengthier, complex sentences, I think tend to be for effect and tend to say something quite profound. In this case, the Stasi were methodical is, from a technical point of view, it's a telegraphic sentence. It simply states a fact. The Stasi were methodical. But it's quite sinister, isn't it? Because beyond that, the idea of being methodical, there's something quite sinister, I think, and insidious about the way in which the Stasi carried out their investigations. So sometimes what Funder seems to use are the shorter sentences to have the greatest impact, and certainly it's worth having a bank of those ready for when you're doing the comparative piece, because you can draw on numerous examples of where that happens.
They questioned all the classmates of the boys who had received the pamphlets. They talked to the principal, teachers, parents. Several days went by. Miriam and Ursula agreed on an arrest and incarceration plan. Neither would admit anything. The Stasi arrived at a short list of suspects. Men with gloves and dogs combed Miriam's house.
So that metaphor there, combed the house, and men with gloves and dogs, again, that last sentence there is quite important, because it shows the severity, I think. Men with gloves and dogs, those are symbolic, those are symbols. They're totems, I would describe them as, actually. TOTEMS, totems of power and of investigation. It's the men with the gloves, it's the men with the dogs, they're the ones in charge, they're the ones who are taking lead on the investigation, they're the threat and the authority figures, and they are combing Miriam's house. Now that's something you hear in sort of police procedural crime investigation writing, something that if something's been combed or looked through with a fine tooth comb, it's gone through very thoroughly and meticulously, and as she says, methodically. So it's a metaphor, but it's a very familiar collocation of a sort of crime and procedural verb to use in that case.
And we thought we'd been so careful, thrown everything out and destroyed all the evidence. The Stasi found some of the little rubber letters in the carpet. Miriam's parents told the officers they did not know how such a thing could have happened in their house. Both girls were placed in solitary confinement for a month. They had no visits from their parents or from lawyers, no books, no newspapers, not a phone call.
And there, the asyndetic list there being used. You can describe it as an asyndetic list or simply an example of asyndeton. But in this case, it's lawyers, no books, no newspapers, not a phone call. So listing the range of things that they couldn't have, essentially representing the fact they couldn't have anything. Sorry, I'm not that bored. Hopefully you're not either. So the fact they had no lawyers, parents, no books, no newspapers, not a phone call. It sort of suggests, let's think, is that something else? It's sort of litotes in a way as well, because it's understating it. The fact they've got no books or no newspapers, that's not really the worst of their problems. The fact they've got nothing else. So it's actually understating their situation a little bit. So you've got A. Cinderton there to represent the overwhelming amount that they couldn't have access to and they were deprived from. But the fact that it's books and newspapers that are chosen, I would say hints at, and I would hedge it with hints. I wouldn't say it is litotes. I would say it hints at being litotes, because it's actually understating the problems they've got. It's not the lack of books and newspapers isn't really the biggest problem they have. It's the lack of freedom for a whole month and solitary confinement.
In the beginning, they stuck to their plan. "No, sir, I don't know either how the leaflets got there. No, it couldn't possibly have been her." "But eventually," Miriam says, "they break you, just like fiction. They used the old trick and told each of us that the other had admitted, so we might as well too. After no visits, no books, nothing, you think, well, she probably did say it." The girls were let out to await their trials. When she got home, Miriam thought, there's no way they're going to put me back in that place. The next morning, she got on a train for Berlin. It was New Year's Eve, 1968, and Miriam Weber was going over the wall.
Okay, so what we've got there then is what we've come to expect at the end of chapters from Funda. We get a lead for the next part of the narrative, the next part of her journey. So we get a time marker of 1968 of when this happened, and the fact that what she's doing. So again, another telegraphic sentence there. Miriam Weber was going over the wall. So we've got a simple sentence there, a telegraphic sentence that informs us what's happening. We know that we will learn more about this in the next chapter or further into the book, because that's how we understand writing works, that we're fed some information and then it delivers on that promise, and that's what we had from the first chapter into the second. But we've also got something quite suggestive with that phrase, was going over the wall as well, because that in itself has a subtext to it. Was going over the wall. Yes, it's the literal wall of the Berlin Wall. She's going to go into the West Berlin over the wall, but it also has that suggestion about taking a risk, and it's not just going over a physical wall. It's going against the GDR and against the Stasi, and against the Soviet Union, really. So it's there's more to it than just a physical movement, which of course you'll have picked up on as you heard it. But it's just worth unpicking that metaphor, really, because that's what it is. It's literal, but also a metaphor as well. It operates both in synchronicity. And that's it for chapter 2. I'll see you again for chapter 3 next time.